Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Community Commons Impact Makers series brought to you by Earth Gives. I'm Rhonda Bannard. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Earth Gives, and we exist to catalyze environmental, climate, and climate justice philanthropy so that all of your missions can have an even greater impact. When environmental giving sits at just 2% of all giving, we know that's not enough to meet the demands of the most consequential issues of our time. So that's why we're here. And we believe that thoughtful storytelling and community building are also key to advancing this very thing. And one way to do that is through advocacy. And yet a lot of times 501c3s leave advocacy on the table and don't feel like they can touch it. Yet it is a super tool that can be put to use by us, of course, within guardrails. So we're excited to have Dr. Sristi Kamal with us to share insights as someone who's worked in environmental and wildlife policy. She's worked alongside attorneys and policymakers and a number of other folks. And she's going to help us navigate how we can use advocacy in such a way that it will supersize our abilities. She works with Western Environmental Law Center, which holds a very special place in our hearts at Earth Gives, because WELC, as we call it, was the first to join our startup giving day that we hosted a couple years ago. And then the second year, they did so as well. Before we get going, what I'd love to do is have everyone sort of go around and introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Will. Why don't you tell us who you are, what organization you represent, where you're coming in from, and a little bit about the organization.
Sure thing. Thanks, Rhonda. My name is Will Shoemaker. I am Communications and Engagement Director at Advocates for the West. We are based in Boise, Idaho. We also have an office in Portland, Oregon, and staff kind of spread far and wide across the West. I'm based myself in Gunnison, Colorado, work for the most part remotely, but do come back to our Boise headquarters on occasion. We are a nonprofit public interest environmental law firm doing very similar work to WELC. That being said, I think, we've historically been much more focused on the law side of things and much less so in advocacy. We are finding we're spending more time in the advocacy realm. And so I was very interested in seeing this webinar and what I might be able to gain from it.
That's great. I did want to ask that question, and that's what you answered in when you registered, how we can best engage in advocacy. So thank you for that. David.
My name is Dave Cristiano. I live in Patagonia, Arizona, and I'm on the board of directors of a very, very small group called Friends of Sonoyta Creek. Which is one of the few remaining perennial streams in southern Arizona in the Sky Islands area. And well, it's not, at least it's perennial in some parts. But we collaborate with a number of different groups around the area, like the Nature Conservancy, Tucson Audubon, and some other Borderlands Restoration Network, and we do water sampling on Sonoyta Creek. Trying to assess some of or develop a baseline for of water quality in Harshaw Creek, which is tributary to Sonoyta Creek, and in Sonoyta Creek and Patagonia Lake. We also do wet-dry surveys on those creeks several times, 4 times a year, to find out what's the flow regimes like, when it's flowing and when it's not. And we do a healthy water education program with the Patagonia schools, where the kids have science equipment, microscopes. They sample the water in the lake and look at the water under a microscope and stuff like that. So it was really kind of a fun thing there for them, because after the morning of school, they get to go swim and have a barbecue. So that's just several of the things that we do. We're a very small group. I don't mean to deride ourselves, but I always kind of like refer to us as a ragtag group. And I'm just learning about 501c3s and running a nonprofit, and I just want to learn more.
Great. Thanks, David. Lee.
Hi, I'm Lee Ford. I'm Executive Director of Snake River Alliance and based in Boise, Idaho. And I used to work at Advocates for the West. I started volunteering there, and then they were kind enough to give me a job for a little while as a paralegal, and they do great work, I have to say. I work at Snake River Alliance now, and we started out after 3 Mile Island. We got a bunch of waste sent to Idaho, and it's over our sole source aquifer, EPA designated sole source aquifer, and it supplies over 300,000 people with water. So we were concerned, obviously, and also found out until I think the mid 80s that they were directly injecting radioactive waste into our aquifer. So that ended, and we're keeping close eyes on how they're cleaning up the waste, and are concerned with a current resurgence of the nuclear energy, sort of a renaissance with what they're calling advanced reactors or small modular nuclear reactors, and Idaho is seemingly the test bed for these new things. So we are concerned with new waste streams, of course, and it being over our water, are watching it closely. And we champion non-radioactive renewable energy and are trying to promote that as much as possible in Idaho with a lot of our allies. We're Idaho's only nuclear watchdog, so there's a lot of work to do in Idaho, but a lot of money comes into Idaho for the nuclear industry. So it's been a challenge, but it's also a challenge because the nuclear industry is greenwashing lately, and some people are thinking, they're desperate because of the climate crisis, desperate to look at anything, I think. And so we're very concerned because it's sort of forever waste that we'd end up cleaning up, and future generations would be saddled with that for a very long time. So that's my quick blurb. I'm here for ideas and to see how I can better serve our community.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lee. Jenna, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Kleppel. I'm the Director of Development at Western Environmental Law Center. And I'm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I have colleagues and offices in Eugene, Oregon, Taos, New Mexico, Helena, Montana, and then remote around the Western United States in other locations as well. You'll hear about more of Welk's work from my colleague, Sristi. So I'll go ahead and pass it on.
Great. Thanks, Sristi. It's your turn. You get to get this conversation started. So have at it.
All right. Thank you so much, Rhonda. And really, really nice to meet you both, Will and Lee. And as you know, my name is Sristi Kamal. I am the Deputy Director at Western Environmental Law Center. I'm based out of Portland, Oregon, but today I'm coming to you from our Santa Fe office because I'm in Santa Fe this week. And so Jenna is right down the hall from me right now. Yeah, it's an opportunity to discuss some of the work that we have been doing in policy advocacy and how we have been sort of approaching it, but not fully knowing, the audience or who might show up. I'm keeping the conversation as broad as possible, but with the hopes that we can have like a more engaging discussion. If there are questions that come up that you feel were not addressed in what I am going to be presenting, please feel free to raise them and we can absolutely have a conversation on that. Again, this is just to get the conversation started. So a very quick background about myself. Rhonda already mentioned that, but I am originally from India. I come from a small state called Assam in India, and that's very, very rich in wildlife. We have rhinos, tigers, elephants, the megafauna that you can think of. And so that kind of drove my love for wildlife when I was very young. And so I knew I wanted to do wildlife conservation before I knew the word wildlife conservation. So with that, I kind of got started in a career that was very much crafted to the biology and the ecology of wildlife conservation. But as I sort of grew in my academic and professional career, I very much realized that you can have the best available science, but it is the people on the ground that can make or break a conservation effort. So how do we connect with those people, and how do we make them a part of the conservation equation? So I sort of shifted my work towards more of the human dimensions of conservation, environmental conservation, specifically biodiversity conservation. And so I kind of grew professionally in that particular area. And during that growth, again, another sort of realization or stepping stone for me was that every part of our work at the end of the day is very, very influenced by policies that are not necessarily determined by us, policies that are not necessarily crafted by us, but it has a very strong influence on every piece of work we do, whether it's with local communities, whether you feel you're maybe like 5-6 steps separate from that policy being drafted. But at the end of the day, our organization's mission and work gets very, very influenced by that. So I started sort of dipping my toes in the policy world, and kind of, I think, fell headfirst into that pool and learned how to sink or swim in the policy world. My background, as Rhonda mentioned, is research. I have a PhD in ecology, but what I learned very quickly in policy is that it is less about skills or your technical qualification. It's more about relationship building, gaining trust, and then really figuring out those points of influence. So I really sort of narrowed down on that. Prior to Western Environmental Law Center, I was at Defenders of Wildlife, which is a national wildlife conservation organization in the US. And in that role, I was working very heavily at the legislature, as well as with state boards and commissions for policy advocacy. I moved to Western Environmental Law Center as their deputy director. And a very quick brief about WELC, we are a 501c3. And as Will mentioned, we are kind of similar in our organization structure to theirs in the sense that we are primarily a litigation-based organization. That's what we are known for. We are a public interest environmental law firm. And about 70% of our staff are staff attorneys. But that said, we are also very much aware that policy, the ones that we defend in a lawsuit, the ones that we have to fight in a lawsuit, are all crafted by someone at some point. And if we don't start there, we are always reactionary or reacting to someone else's defined policy. So we started moving more towards that policy advocacy work as well. So while we are still primarily litigation-based organization, we have staff who engage both at the federal and state level on influencing policies. As Jenna mentioned, we are operating out of the Western US, out of many states, and our focus remains in all of the Western US, even though we may or may not have geographical presence in terms of office in that area. And so I will talk a little bit about policy advocacy and what I mean by that. As I mentioned, I started from like pure science, moved on to the people part of the equation, and then into policy. And in that transition, I realized that, you know, what we're trying to do in our work is basically bring a shift in attitude or perception of people, or a change in behavior of how they're using a resource, their dependency on it, their misuse of it. And ultimately, when it comes to like what we are witnessing more and more in the US in terms of culture wars, it's also a shift in values. How are we going to influence value shifts, which in turn changes behavior and perceptions? So all of these three are very, very heavily influenced by changes in policies, because policies put sideboards or side rails on how people can behave, how their values can shift versus cannot. So whether we like it or not, whether we engage in it or not, whether it is our organization's mission or not, policies will continue to influence our priority issues. If you are a community-based organization and do not engage in policy advocacy, the community you are working with on whatever your priority issue is are going to be influenced by their local policies. And so whether we have a say in it or not, they are here to stay. And so it is better to be more proactive than reactive to policy advocacy, which is why we sort of went in and decided that we are going to engage more actively in policy advocacy. So again, for a lot of organizations, policy advocacy may not be part of their main goal or objectives, but that does not mean that you have to be a policy advocacy organization to influence policies. The number one thing, which is the basic thing I think we all kind of try to do in our organizations, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, is to familiarize ourselves with policies that influence our work and the communities or audience we serve. So for our organization, for example, whether I work directly at a federal level or not, I would familiarize myself with all the climate and energy related policies that will influence WELT's work, that will influence the lawsuits that are going to come in that our clients will bring to us. That will influence our clients' communities. We are not working directly with communities, but our clients and partners are. So familiarizing yourself with the policies, all of them, local, county level, state level, federal level, is the number one thing you should absolutely do. Because once you know when those policies, what those policies are, you will also be aware of the cyclical processes of changes to those policies, which are also very, very important to be aware of, because those are your points of engagement. Then the second important thing is we are a 501c3. I think a lot of you are 501c3 as well. So knowing where the boundaries or those lines are for a 501c3 and not crossing it, but absolutely walking up to that line is what I recommend in policy advocacy. So of course, we are 501c3, we have restrictions around lobbying. But what qualifies as lobbying versus what does not, having an understanding of that. If you are engaging in lobbying, what are the limitations and restrictions for your organization, like the number of hours, for example, that you can as a whole organization lobby, and who and how you are using that within your organization, being aware of that. So while we are all very scared of the idea of lobbying, because we are all 501c3 and we do not want to be on the wrong side of the law there, do understand that the law does allow us to a degree of lobbying and policy advocacy on that front. And we should feel empowered to use that part of what we are allowed and not leave that on the table. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what part of the policy advocacy, what are we trying to do in the policy advocacy world? Well, we are trying to advance or improve on policies. So the number one thing is we have some environmental policies are great, but are they living up to the current times? And what would the next generation of environmental policies look like? So that's the more proactive approach towards policy advocacy. The other one, which is what we are, I think, unfortunately more familiar with, is the reactive piece, which is defending against dismantling of bedrock environmental policies. We saw a lot of that happen, unfortunately, during the Trump era administration. For us, for example, I come from a wildlife world, so the federal delisting of wolves in the lower 48 states was a huge issue for us, because we don't think that was based in scientific information and was a political decision rather than a social or ecological one. And so we fought that and we won that case. But that was like a huge nationwide campaign with multiple partners and coalitions of groups that participated in that lawsuit that ultimately resulted in that outcome. So there's of course, there's constant defending. For us, it's a constant defend of the Endangered Species Act, of NEPA, of the Water Act, Clean Air, Clean Water Act. All of those are a constant defense we have to play to protect the bedrock environmental policies that our societies sort of rely on for our well-being and health. And then the third piece of policy advocacy is to try and hold institutions and agencies accountable to the current policy, whether they're implementing it correctly, whether they're following the processes right, whether they're doing their due diligence in all of the work that they're supposed to be doing. That's kind of the third prong of policy advocacy that we engage in. So depending on your organization, you might have preference for one over the other, or you might be engaging in all three. It doesn't matter which prong you rely on, all three are elements of policy advocacy. So within those three prongs, what can nonprofits do or help in policy advocacy? The number one thing I think is bridging the gap between science and policy. Unfortunately, whether you speak to your lawmaker or not, somebody is speaking to them. And so they are hearing from a side. And we never know whether that side is putting forward the best available information, the best available science to our lawmakers. That, coupled with the fact that you have community pressures and other political interests at play, it's a very muddled environment. So in that, the science gets lost. So as nonprofits that we rely very heavily on, at least for Western Environmental Law Center, I can speak for that, we rely very heavily on the best available science to make our arguments in litigation. We use the same approach in our policy advocacy to make sure that the policies are informed with best available science. And then, of course, just you presenting that information doesn't really get you anywhere. We all have been there, where you can speak with your rationale and your truth, and somebody will be swayed by other values. So that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But that, coupled with long-term relationship building and educating your audience. So your audience could be communities, your audience could be lawmakers, your audience could be the broad public. Depending on who you communicate with as an organization externally facing, all of those are your audience. And showing that you are interested in these issues and that you care that they should be interested in these issues can help move that needle that you need for the support that you need for a policy change. The third important piece, and it is becoming ever more relevant, is ensuring the principles of equity, inclusion, and justice are built into policies. That sometimes is not the priority for lawmakers, as we have all witnessed in many different situations. But when we are environmental organizations, we are advocating for the environment itself, but we are also advocating for the people who are going to live in that environment. So we have to be aware that the conservation benefits are not limited to the privileged few, and the cost of conservation isn't borne by the underserved and underrepresented communities alone. So finding that balance is sometimes hard in policy, but we as a nonprofits have that special ability because we are connected to the ground. We care about these issues in a way that's different from lawmakers who are trying to win the votes, that we can keep that lens intact. And as long as we are aware of it and are able to communicate on that, that can really, really influence people's perception and opinion about certain policies. And the third piece, the fourth piece that I've already kind of touched upon, is representing the public's voice. Whether we choose to speak up or not, somebody is speaking up. So who's speaking up for the voices that we are representing if it's not us? Are they able to? Are we empowering them to be able to do that themselves? Or are we being the voice for them? Both are important, but we should be supporting either or both of those requirements for public engagement in policy advocacy. I'll touch a little bit on engaging with lawmakers as a 501c3. So for example, I am registered as a lobbyist in Oregon, even though I'm a 501c3, because we will stick as a 501, in Oregon law, if you are advocating or lobbying for more than 24 hours, you have to be registered as a lobbyist. That's just the law. So I know when I engage in the legislature that depending on the issues I'm going to engage in, that my time period is going to be more than 24 hours of direct engagement. So I'm registered as a lobbyist. Of course, I still have to work within the parameters of what a 501c3 is allowed in terms of hours. So for example, in Defenders of Wildlife, it being a national organization and higher staff capacity and higher revenue, the limit of number of hours for the whole organization was different than WELC. But knowing those hour limitations and being respectful of that, but also not leaving those hours at the table because we are a 501c3. is important. So when you engage with decision makers, there are multiple ways to think about this. One is when you're talking about a very specific policy. Let's say there is a bill that you or your coalition partner has put forward, and you are advocating very specifically about that bill, that you want them to support this bill, you think it's great for XYZ reasons. That's direct lobbying. So that counts as lobbying. Whereas if I am going up to a lawmaker and I want to talk generally about, let's say, poaching, like poaching is a big issue in Oregon. I want to talk about why those are concerning to me, what current policies are lacking. That's general education and outreach, or a discussion or communication with lawmaker. That's not lobbying. I'm not asking them to vote on something. I'm not talking about a specific legislation. I'm not talking about a specific policy. So knowing the difference between what qualifies as lobbying versus what doesn't is also very important. Also, advocacy does not, as I mentioned, does not have to be a bill or a specific legislation based. It can be cause based. Whatever your organization's cause is, knowing that and communicating that to lawmakers so that they recognize you as a go-to person for whenever that issue comes up for a discussion is very important. Half of the time, I don't even know all the wildlife bills that are going up in a session. It's impossible to keep track of. But them recognizing that Western Environmental Law Center engages in policy, that our primary interest is wildlife and wildlands, means, and the number of years, of course, that I have put in building those relationships with lawmakers, means that they will reach out to me and do a quick check of like, hey, we are seeing this. How are you guys feeling about this bill? So that checkpoint is only because of the years and amount of relationship building and trust building that goes with lawmakers. And you don't need a bill to start building those relationships. You can absolutely do that as constituents. You can absolutely do that as groups that represent their constituents. You can do it in many different ways, but that relationship of trust is very important. And by no means I want to say you will make friends with all lawmakers. We know that's impossible. There are sides around environment. There's always more sides. I always say that at the legislature, environment is one of the easiest trading card for lawmakers. And within that, wildlife is probably even more easy. So we are often traded for other issues. So there's always that risk that hangs over my head. But other than that, those relationships really help solidify, where we position ourselves and where lawmakers position themselves. Sometimes you will realize as you talk more with decision makers that they are very, very limited in their understanding of the issue. They have to be sort of jack of all trades. So therefore they're master of none. So they really don't know, and they're making split decisions. So if you position yourself in a way that they count on you as a resource to go to ask about something, you have that moment in time to influence their opinion. You have that moment in time to influence their position on a particular issue. So make most of that. That's not lobbying, that's you educating, that's them reaching out to you. And lastly, we all sort of struggle a lot with capacity, resources as nonprofits. So being part of coalitions and partnerships are absolutely critical when we're talking about policy advocacy. It's very difficult to move the needle if you're one group with one position, and especially if you're a small group. But together as a unified front, it is very hard to ignore your opinion. So to the extent possible, if you know of your partners or of groups in your region that you align with in your mission and objectives, and they have strong policy advocacy, connect with them, network with them, work together with them, because they can be that liaison if you cannot be, or you do not have the capacity to be. I rely very heavily on my partnerships in the region to be able to do the policy advocacy I do. And the other piece, so we talked a little bit about decision makers. I want to talk about the public processes as well on public policies. We always come up with opportunities like public comments on a particular petition, or public comments on changing a rule in the law. All of that are opportunities for public engagement in policy advocacy. So for your groups, for example. And for yourself, of course, as a group, if you want to engage in it, but if you feel like you do not have the capacity, but your members and supporters do, absolutely use that as a tool to communicate about A, the fact that you support policy advocacy, and B, that you are trying to support them in advocating for policies. They really go a long way in engaging with your members and supporters. You know, when you reach out to them asking for like donations or contributions, that's one way we engage with them. But if we only do that repeatedly, sometimes especially for individual donors, it can feel like a one-way communication where we are just asking and asking. They support our organization because they believe in our mission, or they support our organization because they like the work we do. If they find an opportunity to engage in the work we do, a lot of them are very excited. That's been my experience, where people feel that, oh, wow, now I actually get involved in the work as opposed to just paying for the work. So that is definitely a really helpful tool to engage if you as an organization do not have the capacity to do so yourself. I'm building off of what I just said to talk a little bit more about the communication piece. As a 501(c)(3) in policy world, we can still inspire policy advocacy through many different communications tools. One of the communication tool I want to highlight is just writing. You know, writing critical analysis about policies that are influencing your work, or you're worried about, or anything that you think will be helpful for your audience to know, or decision makers to know. So think about op-eds and blogs and letters to the editor and that kind of stuff. Because that is, I know it feels like, oh, who's even reading it? But they do. People do, and they make for great communication pieces for donors and members and supporters as well. So they kind of double as a resource for you. Host public events where if you do not have the ability to engage in a policy actively from its beginning to the end, but if you host an event where you bring people up to speed on what particular issue you're working on, and then give them takeaway action items at the end of the day. So people don't like to just hear someone talk. They want to hear, learn, and then, okay, how do I help this cause? I learned about this huge problem with the southern resident orcas and the dying salmon population, and I want the orcas to live, and I don't, as a single individual, have the ability to bring down 4 dams. So how am I going to influence this process? Well, the best way for you to do is to influence your legislator and give them those tips of how to do so. What are they supposed to communicate out to their legislator about? What are the key talking points? Things like that are helpful. I think we all kind of do action alerts and event alerts. They are very helpful for sure. And like I said, they really, from the individual donor perspective, they also go a long way because this is their moment of engagement in our actual work versus just the funding piece of our work. So action alerts and event alerts go a long way, but I would think of them as, don't think of them as opportunities to fundraise. There is, the fundraising opportunity could be down the line. So if you do like year-end fundraising, for example, and you send action alerts all throughout the year, people will feel engaged with you throughout the year and more likely to donate at the end of the year for you. It doesn't mean every action alert has to come with a donate button. And of course, in today's world, it is absolutely impossible to stay away from digital and social media communication strategies. So whether it's you do quick stories, whether you do quick video blogs, whatever it is that you can do about, let's say there is a policy you're absolutely worried about, but you are a 501(c)(3) and you do not want to cross that line of looking like you're lobbying for that policy. Whatever the issue is that the policy is addressing, you can talk about that issue and make a video blog about that issue. So for example, I'm working on the beaver bill in Oregon, and that's my bill. So I'm actively being able to talk about the bill. But let's say I was not working on that bill, but I do care that this bill passes. So I would make a video blog about beavers and the importance they have in our environment with regards to climate change impacts like wildfire and drought, and how they help our human communities survive those catastrophic events. And so that's an indication to the audience that this policy is important. That's also an indication to lawmakers about why this policy is important to you without you specifically talking about the bill. So there are ways to get around that in social media campaigns too. If you're really worried about like going down the lobbying route versus just policy advocacy route. And the last one piece that I really want to talk about also is the who of policy advocacy. We've talked about the what, which is the bills and the policy development itself and how we can engage people in it. But do we have an ability to engage in who's making those policies? And I'm not talking about like campaigns, political campaigns, but more thinking about smaller bodies of decision makers that influence our work who are not maybe elected but appointed. So think about state boards and commissions, for example, or regional boards and commissions. A lot of them are appointed like by the governor or the legislature or somebody, and they're not elected. And those are usually general members of the public. They're not career politicians coming into this world. They are members of the public who volunteer their time on these, whether it's like Fish and Wildlife commissions or water board commissions and things like that. And they are the ones making critical decisions that will influence either the whole state, if you're thinking of the state Fish and Wildlife or state water resources department, they'll influence the entire state, but they are members of the public. So if you can influence who gets to that seat, you can influence the what after. So think about your networks of people that you work with. Why aren't any of our advocates showing up on those boards and commissions? What do we have to do to get them interested? What do we have to get them appointed? Those are critical issues that are sort of kind of in the back burner for most of our organizations because we don't realize the value of that part of advocacy. And the other piece in that, the who, is also representation. Representation matters. And when we think about boards and commissions, almost comes always down to representation of interest groups. Like, do we have a fishing interest group? Do we have an industry? Do we a representation? So that's how seats get divided. But that's not what I mean by representation. Representation isn't just about interest groups, but representation of the community they're supposed to be serving. Do we have enough diversity? Do we have enough skills and experience and education to be able to understand that issue and make critical decisions on those? So those are some of the factors we consider. And I wanted to highlight the example of the Oregon Wildlife Coalition in this matter. So this coalition I started back in 2019 in Oregon. This is a coalition of 8 wildlife conservation groups. We were all working individually in the legislature at state level and struggling. And we realized that bringing us together as a unified front is going to give us a better chance at the legislature as well as at other issues. So WELC is part of it. We have Defenders of Wildlife, Center for Biological Diversity, Portland Audubon, Humane Society of United States. It's a very diverse group of wildlife-based groups in Oregon. And so since we have been able to form this group, one of our priorities has been reforming state fish and wildlife commissions. So who gets elected? And in the last 3 years, we've been where there's been a cycle of change in the commission itself. So there were vacancies that needed to be filled, and we worked actively to make sure that the right people made it to the seats. In Oregon, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Commission is appointed or nominated by the governor, but confirmed by the Senate. So whether we like it or not, we have to engage at the legislature on that issue. And so in the course of 3 or 4 years, we've been able to shift this commission to being a majority women-led. So out of our 7 members, 5 are women. There are 2 women of color. There is a doctorate, 2 of them with PhDs. So for the first time in, I don't know, over a decade, we've had people who actually have a conservation background and not just here's a hunting seat, here's a fishing seat, here's a ranching seat kind of allocation of seats. And that came about with a lot of advocacy around Fish and Wildlife Commission. So now we're getting to see some small benefits of that, where decisions made by these commissions are more progressive, are more conservation minded, not just extractive industry minded. So that's an example I wanted to share of like how sort of coalition building and advocating for something together can really bring a change, and focusing on the who part is just as important as the what part of policy advocacy. And the last piece I wanted to talk about is the donor support, because we all rely very heavily on funding to be able to do our work. Donors are getting very, very savvy about the value of policy advocacy. So whether you frame yourself as a policy advocacy organization or not, including a theory of change of your work and how that leads to a policy change, or how that can potentially influence a policy change, or how that can provide additional information for policy change, is a big picture thinking that donors do appreciate, in my experience. That you are being a voice for your community in this policy change. That's critical. A lot of environmental funders are also very conscious of the social impact of the work you're doing. So tying those two always makes sense for them. It is very easy to tell stories in policy advocacy because there is always a story of change there, whether you tell it from one person's perspective. Let's say it's somebody in the community you were working with, and this policy change brought a change in their economic or social or environmental well-being. That's a story worth telling a donors. Donors love numbers, but they love stories more. They love to hear how your work brought a real meaningful change in someone's life, or something's life, whether it's a habitat or water stream or whatever it is that you're working on. Also, this makes it very easy to talk about if you're drafting a proposal, the concept of your work, and linking it to ground reality. This is how you're going to do this work by engaging X communities in this many projects and delivering in X many deliverables. But all of that ties to bringing a change, a big picture change, and what that big picture change is, creating that mental map for donors is very important. And if that big picture change is a policy, that goes really well too. It can be others. I'm not saying policy is the only one, but that small conceptual to ground reality to big picture is a really attractive package for donors. And lastly, there is an increasing interest, especially with climate change impacts and our extinction crisis and everything else we're facing, that how are we talking about reconciling humanity's place in the natural world? And a lot of that is driven by policy. So connecting our work to a policy, even though we are not working on it, is going to be important if you're presenting it as a case to a donor. So these were some of kind of my initial thoughts that I wanted to share. I don't know if this addressed any of the questions you had in mind coming into this webinar, but I'm happy to also take questions and make this a more open discussion.
That was fantastic. Thank you. Gosh, I'm scribbling down a bunch of notes, so I'm sure people have comments, ideas, or questions. So have at it, anybody.
Thank you, Sristi. I have a question. You talked about the experience that you've had in influencing lawmakers, and if I understood correctly, it was in large part because of your earlier lobbying experience. For an organization or an individual that doesn't have that sort of lobbying experience, do you see any way that we might be able to gain the sort of influence on lawmakers? And
Absolutely.
What might those routes be?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So I do want to clarify, when I came to WELC, I had lobbying experience, but when I started at Defenders of Wildlife, I did not have lobbying experience. So I kind of was thrown off the deep end there of the pool and like, here you go, sink or swim. So in that situation, what really helped me was really sitting down and figuring out the lawmakers that from their previous sort of voting patterns, what have you, or the policies they have put forward, who tend to be progressive, approaching them with no ask, just here's who I am, this is the organization I represent, would love to hear about your priorities, if there are any that overlap with my organization mission, and how can I be resourceful or helpful for you? those questions open so many doors for me. It's really surprising because I feel that in their world, it's always a give and take relationship. So whenever somebody approaches and offers something, it almost feels like, okay, and what do you want in return? Is the question they will have to ask. So when you come with like, I want to be resourceful for you, that's really helpful. The other piece that really helped me was partnering with groups that are already known entity in that world and going to meetings with them, showing up in places with them, and then building my connection after. So going in with an entrusted entity and then using that to build my own trusted relationship. So that had been very helpful for me too. And honestly, like I remember my first legislator meetings where me saying, I am not a lobbyist. I am a PhD with zero understanding of the legislature. Like I started like that, like, but I have my knowledge about this and this, and I know your priority issues are this. Are you working on anything this session on these issues? Can I be helpful on that? So that really opened doors. Like they sent me draft bills and asked for like expert opinion on those issues. Like, what do you think? Does the language look scary, or like things like that? And now after 4, 5, 6 years, it's reached a point where they know me by name and I know them by name. But it's a legislature, right? So there is a cycle. Some people move out, new people's come in, so you have to keep repeating this cycle, unfortunately, at the legislature every 3, 4 years. Because right now in Oregon, for example, 24% of our legislators are brand new this session. Like nobody knows them, they're brand new. So I have had to do that part of relationship building again this session, but I'm hoping I'll reap off of that in the next session.
If I might add something too to that, Sristi, because Will, perhaps like you, I come from the communication side of things. And when she was talking about that, I was like, oh, I mean, I've been used to presenting nonprofit clients to the media as the experts, but not so much the legislature, until there were some that I thought of more key, like the Academy of Pediatrics and some other entities that had things specifically around policy. So yeah, the light went off for me too. And I think what she's saying a little bit is, you're non-threatening when you come in just to say, hey, we've got some experts. And like you said, they don't know what they're doing. They want to look smart. So how do you help them look smart at the things that they're trying to take on? So anyway, great question. Lee, do you have a thought or question or comment?
No, it's all really good feedback. I got my first lobbying experience actually recently with the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability when we went to DC, and it was amazing. So if there are any groups like that that do lobbying on a regular basis, ANA does it once a year, and we spent about almost a week in DC, and it was intense. It was a huge learning experience, and yeah, when you're with these people, you realize that they don't know everything. I'm always worried that I'm going to sound like an idiot, or I'm not going to know what I'm talking about. But yeah, we're actually the experts on the on the issue, and they ask us questions. So it was I'm glad I went, because it wasn't as scary, I think, as I built it up to be in my mind. And I'm sure state legislators are less, I don't know, less scary to approach, but I'm not sure. I haven't tried the state yet, but
it's kind of similar. I would say the only difference being that I think at the state level, because they see the connection between their constituents and you even more, if you can draw that connection, they're even more likely to listen to you. Because believe it or not, at least my experience in Oregon has been that they would take a call from any single constituent. They will never reject an email or a phone call or anything. So if you can say that you represent, or some of your communities or supporters or members or funders are from their community or their constituency, it goes a really long way in getting their attention.
I have a couple other thoughts, and then David, I'm going to put you and see if you've got a question too. But again, as a communicator, and a long time ago when I did a presentation with a colleague on advocacy, some of the super simple tactical things that I think we leave on the table is if there's a season for voter registration, adding a link on your email signature, because what's the tool that we use most often? It tends to be our email. So there's a link to get people to vote. There's simple things like even on your social media, you can share that. You're not advocating for a policy or anything. You're just saying, hey, get involved in the civic process of democracy, because we know that's as important as what we're doing. So there's really simple things that you can just engage. And I loved how you touched on those, Sristi, about just op-eds and letters to the editor and different things. And volunteers, board members, they all love engaging in that. When I've done board development training, I ask somebody, tell me about your favorite movie, and they start going on and on about a great movie, and I go, well, why wouldn't you do this for the organization you sit on the board of? That's advocacy. You're advocating for your favorite movie, favorite book, favorite restaurant, whatever we do. So it's taking sort of the fear, like you said, Lee, away. I spent some time on the Hill too, and I'm like, this is not all that, this is like, they're just people, so how do we talk to them? So anyway, David, over to you.
Okay, I was very interested in your comments, Sristi. One of the, especially what's concerned me in my small little volunteer group has been, getting into the lobbying, crossing that line into lobbying versus the policy advocacy, because and the potential then for I guess our the other side, in a sense, use that to as retribution. I'm wondering, has there ever been a case where like we are a thorn in the side of a new mine that's coming into Patagonia. Patagonia is a very tourist, based economy, trying to evolve into what they call a restoration-based economy. But, the mine is the mine, it's a part of the community, it's not going to stop, but, we could make sure, that, things are done better than what's been done in the past at other locations to preserve, our community, because it's really, the reasons I see a threat to the reasons of why I just moved here 4 years ago, because it's such a, a remote place with poor, bad broadband, I might say. That's why I, got disconnected and took a while to get back on. But has there ever been a case where, one group has used the idea of advocacy versus lobbying against a non-lobbying organization?
I mean, nothing comes specific to my mind, David, but the sort of the guard, if you will, in that situation is often the state's sort of lobbying commission. So for example, in Oregon, it's the Oregon Ethics Commission. And so if you are lobbying over 24 hours, you're supposed to be registered with them, and they're keeping tab of your hours. So depending on your status, you have to disclose your organization status. So mine is 501c3. In your situation, David, if you feel like you're at the cusp of whether I want to go down the policy, sorry about that. And so we have a policy. If you're thinking around the sort of at the line of whether you are lobbying versus policy advocacy, especially when you are a grassroots organization like yours and a small one, the biggest tool you have is to educate and support your members and supporters, as well as individuals like yourself, And then represent you, not your organization, but represent yourself as private citizens and talk to your legislator. That's not lobbying. That's you as a citizen talking to your representative about the issue you care about. So if all of you as private citizens start calling, even if you're 10 of you, that's still a big number for them to hear from. So then we move away from the organization's lobbying piece to individual or grassroots lobbying. But that one is, especially if you're doing it for yourself and you're representing you and not your organization and you're clear about that, that's easy to navigate. So that's one way that I've seen smaller organizations deal with that. For us at WELC, for example, we don't work directly with communities. We have partners and other groups that do that. But then they would send out action alerts or event alerts, like here is a commission meeting, it would be lovely for you to testify on, and these are some of the key issues being discussed in that meeting. Or here's a bill that's going up for a hearing, and that's the only thing they do. After that, it's on the private citizen to do something about it. So I do feel that for you, the most beneficial, if you are worried that it's coming down to a point of lobbying versus policy advocacy, you can shift from an organization mode to a private individual mode and represent yourself and still speak to your representative.
Yeah, fortunately, we collaborate with another local, 501c3 who are
That's great.
lobbyists.
Okay.
So if we
perfect.
sign on to something, they send a letter, that could be clearly a lobbying thing. If we as an organization just sign on to it for with them, is that, that's not lobbying, that's just agreeing.
That's you.
A lobbyer,
If the letter is specifically about a policy, it would still qualify as lobbying. But every state, and I don't know the exact number, but every state has a certain bandwidth for every organization to be able to use for lobbying, like you're mentioning. It's not very small. So for example, even in Oregon, if I have 24 hours, that literally means 24 actual hours. It's not like Monday morning to Monday evening type situation. So a legislator meeting is 15 minutes. You don't get more than that. And unless you're working with them on a bill, in which case you will get more time. But if you're advocating for them, you get 15 minutes. How many 15 minutes windows do you need to make up 24 hours? It's a lot. So you can walk up to the line very easily and not cross it and still use your lobbying power. So I'm sure for Arizona, there is some, I don't know the exact number, but I'm sure you guys also have some number that allows you to be able to do that.
For some reason, I'm remembering 20% of all your work, but I would need to look at that. And David, I could probably find it from you through the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits, which I'm a member of and past board chair. If there's not any other question, I do have maybe one final question that sort of combines a little bit of what David and Will have brought up. So anybody have a specific? Will, go ahead.
I just want to share an observation, and I am curious about your thoughts, Sristi, on the role that this plays. So the majority of my career has been spent in journalism, and especially in a small community. I always recognize the opportunity that even grassroots nonprofits had in influencing, in the same way that you were talking about, how a legislator kind of has to be a jack of all trades. So do small town newspaper people in particular, but I think all media folks to a degree as well. And there's really an opportunity that I saw over time based upon that role to build relationships with those nonprofits. And I think you can kind of help, nonprofits can help educate those journalists about these issues that they're covering in a way that really establishes a lot of trust. And they will start calling you as a nonprofit representative. If they don't quite understand an issue and they need some explanation, you're the expert as a nonprofit representative that they'll call and they'll say, hey, can you explain this to me? It doesn't quite make sense. And that then has the effect of reframing how they cover that particular issue. oftentimes it's in a much more beneficial way to that nonprofit than otherwise. So I'm interested in hearing from you kind of the role that that media outreach plays in shifting policy. It's much less direct than going, say, straight to a lawmaker. But how much does it seem in your experience to influence what ultimately is the policy that's adopted?
That's a really good question, Mel, and I think it's an important one to touch upon today. Absolutely agree with you that I feel the same relationship building you do with lawmakers or any person of power position that you want to influence applies to media. And I think you're absolutely right that media staff also struggle with finding like who are the good sources, who are the consistently reliable sources we can go to for this information. And over time, like for organizations like WELC, we're like a mid-sized organization, and then Defenders was a much bigger organization, and we had staff, like communication staff, who would maintain those relationships with media. But for a small grassroots level organization, it's almost one-on-one, where you are the person who are the communication expert here and are reaching out to the media person. And my general observation has been that's generally worked in our favor. When you have that media relationship and a trusting relationship, even if that particular media outlet is trying to show or play an unbiased role and try to highlight both perspectives, at least yours is not lost, number one. Sometimes otherwise it's just the other side and that's all you hear. And the other piece is during like legislative sessions or key boards and commission issues that come up, during that time, any media piece related to them, they care very much. They care very much. It doesn't matter whether it's a small media outlet, whether it's a media outlet in the capital city, it doesn't matter. They will pay attention. Their staff do pay attention to that. So having that media relationship and maintaining that, not that you can influence media in a way that they will only show your side of the story. And I, to an extent, have ethical issues with that too. So I think it's fair to show both sides. But I can give you a more recent example, like Oregon Public Broadcasting had reached out to me to ask about an interview for a specific issue. And they had also reached out to the opposition side. They didn't hear back from the opposition side. They heard me, but they still interviewed me and went ahead, and that became our story now. And now that they know I am reliable, I'm available, they are more inclined to reach back out to me for another issue related to WILA that might come up. So that's one example, but I think there are always those messaging. We always have certain newspapers that see, I don't know, you as the wolf person, and any wolf related issue, they will call you, or like you're the habitat person, you're the water person, and they will always reach out. So for our organization like WELC, our communication staff is able to maintain and know like, oh, this particular news might be of interest to this particular media outlet, and they'll send it, and they're interested, they'll set up a meeting. But for a small grassroots organization, you might have to do that yourself, but there is value in doing that.
And I have to pipe in as a former journalist, but in the TV space, I would say, well, that the landscape of media is changing so rapidly, and where people get their information, as we all know, is very diffuse now. And so we have to show up in a lot of ways. And I think the idea of taking sides is a loaded comment, whereas like Sristi, what you often said is, I'm just providing you some information. And a lot of times lawmakers or people aren't necessarily sold by facts and figures, they're sold by story. And so that question that I had that both David and Will made me think about is, there's also a trend in journalism that's called solutions journalism. How do you not just share the information, but how to, like, where's the action? How do you change this? So it's interesting to watch that navigate, but how do we, as people who are advocating, which means education, sharing information, sort of navigate that line with donor types and others to engage them in a little bit more takeaway. So it's not like, here's the problem, here's the problem, here's the problem. There's often not solutions. There's often not, well, what do I do about it? What do I do about the wolves or the beavers or the the heat or whatever. And it just, I think it leaves, people sort of feeling lacking. So I think there's an interesting communication and storytelling navigation opportunity for us to think more deeply. It's something that I think about a lot as it relates to Earth Gives. And then I guess my final comment before Sristi, you can just kind of wrap up, is that I'm actually toying with the idea of bringing in a couple climate and environmental journalists to talk about the state of coverage, how they're seeing that, because you are seeing entities kind of stand up climate desks, as they call it, or climate groups of reporters and all of that. And I think it would be really interesting to have a couple folks come on and say, what are you seeing in this space and how can we go? Like there's a lot of talk about why are meteorologists only talking about, these huge storms versus saying this is brought on by climate change. And, like, how do we kind of think about the narration around that? That can help, infuse what we're all sort of working on. So just food for thought based on my experience. But Sristi, boy, this was like power packed, full of information. I got a lot of ideas from it. So your final thoughts.
Oh no, I'm just grateful for you all for joining me today. And I think this was a really, really productive conversation. I learned a lot too. And just knowing that all of us are going through similar experiences in our own world is also, there's like solidarity in that, where you're not like isolated and feeling like you're on a struggle bus by yourself. So this is always helpful. I really like building communities within our environmental community. So please do feel free to reach out and stay in touch and engage where there are opportunities. I'd very much welcome that.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Jenna, for helping arrange this. And I hope you both have a really great board retreat there in Santa Fe. Enjoy. And Will and Lee and David, it was a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for joining us. And we'll hopefully see you again on another Community Commons Impact Makers series. Take care, everybody.